So we begin. The Word was made flesh. Of course, we are very familiar with this from the prologue of John, which is so important for our own congregation. Jesus was made flesh, became flesh. Christ became flesh in a very particular place. Fully human and fully divine. Being fully human, he took flesh in a very particular place. He wasn't a universal person. He was a concrete person. He learned a certain language. He lived in a particular geographical space during a very limited amount of time, 33 years that we say. So he took flesh in a very particular context. Now, in all cultures, when you were born into all cultures, we started talking about this yesterday in terms of the iceberg and things like that. This is an image I've again drawn from Tony Gittins and from another book that he wrote. And this is sort of taken from the social sciences. So cultures basically look at the world as us and them. I'm talking culturally now. Obviously, this is not just ethnicity. This also applies to other things as well. In the us category, there are those who are the participant insiders in a culture, and there are non-participant insiders in a culture. I'm going to explain that a bit more in that way. The them, people of the others, there are the participant outsiders, and there are the non-participant outsiders. And what we're doing in this first presentation is to see how did Jesus move from being, he was a participant insider as a male in his society, how he moved from there to the non-participant insiders through table fellowship. But then we're going to focus more on how he crossed this line and he engaged those who were the participant outsiders and the non-participant outsiders, women of other cultures, for example. Okay. Now this is our challenge as well. Within our own culture, there are the participant insiders, the non-participants, and there are the thems, us and thems. And this polarity of us and thems is what interculturality is addressing in a broad sense that we talked about yesterday. This is an image that Adriana shared. She worked in Bariloche in southern Argentina before she became provincial. And here's an image from Bariloche, the town in Argentina. I don't know if any of you, I know some of you have worked in Argentina before. I think, Paul, you worked there, I think, Joe Scott. But anyways, you can see this is the same town. So this is one part of the town where people are living in this type of situation. And you just go a couple blocks over, and this is the tourist side of the town. So the us and them categories, the participant insiders, the non-participant insiders, in that way. So in terms of economics. Now this fundamental distinction between us insiders and them outsiders, on a positive side, it provides groups a space to nurture their own culture, to cultivate their environment, to create and hand on particular pattern of meanings which constitute their specific cultures. In other words, culture is important, us and them, for the sake of meaning, identity, and order. It gives a sense of meaning and belonging that all human beings need. So on a positive side, identifying who we are. So our own culture, we are to be proud of that. That is something that is a good thing. It's important for us. Because some people ask me, does that mean when we talk about interculturality, I have to deny my own culture? No, we honor our culture. The problem is when we use our culture to judge others. So the cultural flow is that this opportunity to choose, separate, and set boundaries, us and them, becomes at the same time a source of exclusion, domination, discrimination, control, privilege, and hierarchy. Steve Evans was reflecting on this on, I think it was Tuesday of this week, when the readings that we had were talking about walls, the different types of walls. And Pope Francis has also talked about walls in his most recent document. So that's what happens. Identity is one thing, but then we use it as a way of exclusion and control over others. Tony Gittins quote here, cultures are built on the lattice work of separation and division, classification and categorization, discrimination and dominion. So this is the thing with societies, the us, them categories, and we do this, and we can see this in the US, but this applies every place. I do a lot of work internationally, and other people say this is for us the same, no matter what part of the world we're in. So if we go back to that framework of the participant insiders, so those us, this is taken from the time of Jesus. We can translate it today, but if we look at the time of Jesus, the insiders, participants of the Jewish community, these are the adult males, the VIPs, the holders of authority, legitimate and power, strength, control, and dominance. When we talk about interculturality, we must talk about power. And this is something that my Latin American colleagues have really taught me very much. They said, you in North America, you talk about interculturality as this sort of nice, sort of everybody getting on with each other in different cultures. But you got to talk about the power dynamics between people of different cultures, or the us and them, again, beyond ethnicity. Who are the others, significant others? Heads of households, members of professions, physicians, bankers, lawyers, clergy, teachers, the Pharisees, the appointed leaders, and those who have power of sanction, of authority, military, police, religious authorities. We know the conflicts that Jesus had with the religious authorities of his time. So these are the participant insiders. Jesus did interact with them. He did. He challenged them. He challenged them in the sense that if they took their of authority to exclude other people. And then we move to the next box below that. These are the non-participant insiders of Jesus' culture. These are the non-adult males, or people considered nobodies, people without authority or no social identity, limited powers. They may not be completely powerless, but limited. There's different degrees to non-participation. Others are the immature, the unborn. Of course, this whole question of the abortion, lacking viability, infants, children. These are people who are the non-participants. And we know that how that happens. Mentally, those who are considered outside, morally, women in general, especially at the time of Jesus. Again, there's some, non-participating males. Jesus did, and so Jesus reaching out to them in his own culture, the Jewish peoples, mentally, those who were roaming around in graveyards, who were possessed or whatever you call them. The criminals, the sinners, the tax collectors, even though they were males, they were considered on the outside of the Jewish culture. Mostly women also within his own culture, and the non-participating adults. We'll talk more about this afternoon around the images of table fellowship. We'll come back to this later on. That's how Jesus related to people within the Jewish culture, but also including those who were the participants and non-participants. So Jesus was deeply moved by the experience of God's option for the little ones, Matthew 11:25. That experience made him move counterculturally to the lower margins of his society. So within his society, from participant to non-participant, as Jesus moved from the position he was born with to where he reached out. Because Jesus filled up how the boundaries that gave them privileges on this earth were making them exclude themselves from God's kingdom where there are no lines of division or exclusion. So Jesus confronted that people who considered them specialized. And we know through, we heard this in the parables and Jesus' own teaching, that he was warning the scribes and Pharisees. It's not that all the scribes and Pharisees were bad, but many of them used their authority in order to exclude or call other people impure. So again, we're back to these categories of the us, participants, non-participants. We've already talked about how Jesus moved from here where he was born as a male. He moved here, across here. We'll talk more about this afternoon. But today we're going to stretch even further. We're going to cross this line. How did Jesus connect with the participant outsiders? Roman centurion, for example, we'll hear about that. And in particular, we're going to focus on the non-participant outsiders through two particular incidences. Okay, see what we're doing here? Interculturality calls us to move beyond these sort of boundaries of the us and them categories. This is within our religious congregation. I've seen it within our own SVDs, and it's also within our ministry, and it's certainly within our society. So how do we move in this way? Jesus is showing us the way. So I'm going to use three biblical icons. This is the language that Adriana used. By the way, Adriana did a lot of study in exegesis and the scriptures as well behind all this. So we're going to look at three particular icons. The first is that of the Canaanite woman, or she's called the Syrophoenician woman, a transformative encounter. Now, we're already familiar with this encounter, so I'm just going to go through this rather quickly, and then we'll highlight a few of the phrases that I've listed here in bold. Jesus is going through a territory of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman came out shouting to him, calling out to him, "Have pity on me, my daughter is full of demons." Here's a mother concerned for her daughter who is possessed. It's spiritual, maybe a mental problem that the child has. She's calling out to him. She's a Canaanite. She's non-Jewish. Syrophoenician woman in another synoptic gospel. Jesus did not say a word. He's silent. She kept calling out. Now the disciples get on and say, "Send her away." She comes and yells, "Please help me, Lord." Then we have the phrase in verse 26. It isn't right to take away from children and feed it to the dogs. This very term that Jesus used, a derogatory term. And this is the term that came from his culture, the term that was used. That's true, the woman says, but even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the owner's table. Then, verse 28, this is very important. Something happens to Jesus. He now is not just seeing a woman who is bugging him, disturbing his plans, or bothering him. And again, what I'm doing here is looking at the human side of Jesus. I'm not denying the divinity, of course. I'm looking at it from the human side in terms as a cultural person as he was, fully human also. Dear woman, you really do have a lot of faith, and you will be given what you want. Jesus recognizes in the other, the stranger, a person of faith. At that moment, the daughter was healed. The Canaanite or Syrophoenician woman is an outsider to Jesus' cultural and religious group. It's cultural and religious. As an insider, Jesus responded to her call at the beginning with the hurtful silence. He didn't say a word. Then later on, disciples were annoyed, and Jesus then said, "I was only sent to the people of Israel, to my people." And later he added, "It isn't right to take food away from children and feed it to dogs." We know ethnocentrism is out there, huh? In so many different ways. And we could add many, many more slides to this of what's been going on in the last year or so in this country, but around the world in that way. Huh? So ethnocentrism is out there, but it's also within us. We constantly have to look at what is that, the us and them categories that we use. I'm 69 years old and I keep finding these new categories of us and them that I face, huh? Ready to jump out when we least think about it, how that can surface at different times, huh? We know this, huh? The challenge of the other. The non-edited, impolite words that Jesus addressed to the woman encourages us to confront ourselves with honesty. I realize some of you might not be comfortable with me saying that Jesus used, impolite words towards this woman. Adriana has done a lot more study in looking at what the scripture scholars say about that use of that term. And it certainly was a derogatory term. And yet Jesus overcomes it. And that's, for me, that's what we can learn. Jesus, as a cultural person, he had the us and them categories. Huh? And there was that struggle within him because he knew that God was bigger than that. And he overcomes it. And he does reach out to the woman. His willingness to answer her question and broaden his vision are a challenge to our own ethnocentrism. To me, that is what we can learn so much from this. Huh? Jesus was willing to move beyond his initial silence. I'm only to go into Israel. Huh? And in terms of, the food is only not for dogs. Huh? So who is the stranger in your own context, in your current experience, ministry, and community? Now, it might not be as stark as with the Syrophoenician woman, but can you identify the minority groups who live among you? And again, this applies within the SVDs as well. When were you confronted with the blindness of your vision because of your prejudices against a stranger? This is something for all of us. As I mentioned yesterday, I've been doing a lot more work and reading about anti-racism. And it's just, it continues to challenge myself. Huh? How can I accompany others if I don't face it within myself? What prejudices, cultural blindness, or barriers have been exposed through such an event? Yeah. And what is the other asking you? What are her, his, or their needs? Huh? Message of the story. As a result of this encounter with the Canaanite woman, Jesus grew in his own understanding of the inclusivity and radical equality of God's reign. It's easy to have the theology, but what does it mean concretely with the people we are with? In a radical way, enriching. Yesterday we talked about the Black Lives Matter issue. I mean, these are big challenges. What we're talking about today with Jesus is the ideal, to overcome any kind of us, them categories, and to see that all people, and to treat people in that way. Wayne Wright, one of the scripture scholars, she writes, she taught him, the woman taught Jesus, a recognition that linked her insight into wholeness with that of God, whose way, whose dream Jesus was to establish on earth. Huh? In a way, the woman was a prophet of the stranger. She was a stranger who was a prophet to Jesus. And again, this may be a little different way that we've thought about this in the past, but she was a stranger. She was a different culture. As a woman, we're crossing the gender too. Remember when we talked yesterday that culture is not just ethnicity, but also our social location, men and women, rich and poor. She's not given a name in the story. She's shown to be interrupting Jesus in Mark and annoying the disciples in Matthew. However, she did not play the victim's card. In other words, she didn't just sort of pull off into a corner and say, poor me. She was concerned for her daughter. We can also imagine the courage, the inner strength, the commitment, the guts, the wit that the woman must have had. These are the very traits that reflect the divine gifts that are needed in order to bring about God's all-inclusive and egalitarian project. What we're doing here is we're not just looking at what Jesus said and did, we're also sort of stepping into the shoes of the woman. And again, we don't know exactly what was going on, but what it was for her, how difficult it was for her, even though she was ignored and shunned and called by a derogatory term, she kept on. Her faith was there and her concern for her daughter. Okay, we're going to move to the second icon. I won't be spending as much time on the second and third as I did on the first. The second is that of the engagement of the encounter. Pope Francis talks about encounter. This is certainly another encounter, as was the first. The encounter with the Samaritan woman. And from the focus of creating alternating spaces. There are many ways of looking at this parable, at this story. Creating. So Jesus goes to the well of Jacob. This is already crossing boundaries. He is crossing through outside his own comfort zone. He was tired. He sat down. It was noon. Samaritan woman came to draw water from the well. I can't go into all the social context. People have said, why is she coming at noon to get water? Was she sort of seen as an outsider in a village? Noon is not the time you'd normally in the heat. As those of you know, if you're living in the tropics, you don't go then at that time. Jesus asked her, would you please give me a drink of water? And she knows who he is by his dress and language. You are a Jew. I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink of water? Jews and Samaritans won't have anything to do with each other. So there's the difference here, men and women, culturally and religiously. Eventually, we skip to verse 19. The woman, after their initial sharing back and forth, talking about the water, she recognizes him as a prophet. In terms of her own religious identity, she says, my ancestors worshiped on the mountain. But you Jews say that Jerusalem is the only place to worship. Okay, where do we worship? What's our religious? What's our spirituality? Jesus said to her, believe me, the time is coming when you won't worship the Father, either on the mountains or in Jerusalem. The time is coming already here. Even now, true worshipers are being led by the Spirit to worship the Father. These are the ones the Father is seeking to worship him. God is Spirit. And then we move into the theological. She recognizes him as or thinks that he may be the Messiah. Okay. So something has happened in this way. The disciples come back and they wonder what Jesus is doing talking. Why is Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman? So in this conversation, through this dialogue back and forth, Jesus not only crosses national, cultural, religious, and gender barriers. The Samaritans are considered half Jews. Historically, they are related, but there was that division that happened in the Hebrew scriptures. We hear about that. But he's engaging the Samaritan woman also in a theological quest. So that's what we're going to skip to. We can talk about the cultural, religious, the gender, how many husbands she's had, all of that. Again, the holistic picture. But if we focus on that last one now, the theological quest, in terms of their deepest true identity and call. What happens in this conversation as we get towards the end is that they discover that in their own religious searching and yearning, rather than either the mountains or Jerusalem as a place of worship, it's both and. So as shown in that image here, God is worshipped in the temple, as we know from the Jewish tradition, later in the synagogues. And God is worshipped in high places, the mountaintops, as the Samaritans. Jesus is saying God is to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. So again, what happens with this encounter with the other? Jesus is being stretched. Jesus is being enriched. Jesus is enriching the other to understand that God is bigger than our own categories, even our religious categories and our spirituality, that God is bigger than we know. Again, it doesn't take away from our own religious traditions, our good Jewish religious traditions, our good Samaritan religious traditions. But wait a minute, How can we appreciate the religious and spirituality of the other? Of course, this applies to us in our own, with our confreres, and also in our ministry. A true intercultural encounters expands our image of God. The Spirit inspires us and moves us toward new spaces of encounter. Pope Francis' term. Dialogue, freedom, and mission. Spaces of both and paradoxes of intercultural life. In other words, that both and categories that we need to recognize in this way. Very powerful. And we're going to talk more about this tomorrow too. How are we enriched by the spirituality of our fellow confreres, or by the spirituality of the people that we serve in ministry? How does this happen? God is bigger than we think. Again, we don't deny our own spirituality. It's stretched in a good sense. The third icon we're going to use is that of the Good Samaritan parable, identifying with the stranger and reaching out with a merciful heart, a heart of compassion. So identifying with the stranger. An expert of the law, somebody who is a participant insider in Jesus' own culture. He asked Jesus the question, what must I do to have eternal life? Okay, and Jesus asked him what is in the scriptures. And of course, the man knows it perfectly. And he says, you've given the right answer in verse 28. Verse 29, but the man wanted to show that he knew what he was talking about, He felt secure. He felt secure in what he was doing. So he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? Jesus replied with the parable that we know so well. A man going from Jerusalem to Jericho is attacked, robbed, left for half dead, very seriously beaten up. A priest happens to go by. A priest is an insider participant in Jesus' culture. Later, a temple helper came to the same space. Again, somebody who is a participant insider in the culture. And they both walk by. Part of the concerns of walking by is if they would have attended to him, that means that they probably would have been ritually impure themselves, and they would have had to go through a ritual in order to re-enter the temple again. That's just part of the social context. Whatever the case is, they did not help. Then a man from Samaria, a Samaritan, a half Jew, if I use that language, he came traveling along the road. He saw the man. He felt sorry for him, compassion, mercy. He treated his wounds, took care of him, put him on his donkey, took him to an inn. Next day, he goes the extra step. I have to move on in my trip, but please, here's some money to take care of him, and I'll stop by on my way back. He's certainly going way beyond the call of duty, the call of human duty, but he's following a much deeper duty. Which of these people was a real neighbor? Going back to the religious specialist, was the one who showed pity. Jesus said, go and do the same. This is amazing. Jesus is using a Samaritan as the ideal disciple. He's using a non-Jew as the disciple. This is an unbelievable that he did this. Unbelievable. To take someone who's considered an outsider that's the disciple. Abraham was a person of mercy, other. Jesus reversed the terms of the question, and he challenged the lawyer's social location, his social location of authority and power, his religious worldview, and the context from where he was asking the question. This is where we see Jesus challenging the participant insiders in his own culture with this question. And he's telling him to look from the us to the thems. With the parable, Jesus invited him to cross the boundaries of his privileged position and a founder of countercultural logic. Jesus challenged a lawyer to drawing his attention to the victims of the road. Take a look at them. See them. As Mother Teresa saw those who were laying in the gutters in Calcutta. Look for those who are the excluded ones. And he pointed towards the outsiders. So he's both looking at the victims within one's own culture, but he's also pointing to the outsiders as the example to be imitated. This is amazing. And again, when I say this, we are to follow Jesus. Implied in the story is a crucial clue that the lawyer did not miss. It was compassion which made this double movement possible and even desirable. Within our own culture and then stepping outside of our own culture. Again, remember, culture is bigger than just ethnicity. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for us? This is a very strong quote from Tony Gittins. You see that I draw a lot on Tony Gittins' work. Because humanity has become so scandalously separated and opposed, we individually and corporately must make a choice. Either we choose to continue sinning by exclusion, separation, and boundary maintenance, and every day eat and drink judgment to ourselves, or, second choice, we resolve today to embrace God's radical option for humanity, and with God's help and our steadfastness to change our lives. There is no third way. This is what interculturality entails. This is a very strong statement. I know my recent reading in terms of racism, it's like we're not talking about being non-racist, but being anti-racist. So there's a choice on which way we stand. Intentional. The future of humanity and of the church may depend on this, the choice that we make. We talked about it yesterday, saying that religious communities, but others too, if they don't go the route of the interculturality and what it requires and what we're talking about here, they may not survive. Only when we dare to move downward to the margins and outward towards the stranger, downwards to the margins within our own culture, outward to the stranger, the thems, we truly discover who we are and what we are called to be as disciples of Jesus. In the encounter with the other, both persons meet in a new space. This is what we saw with Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. The place of compassion for all, the Good Samaritan. As radically inclusive of God's kingdom, it's the disciples' challenge to move downwards and outwards, making themselves neighbors with others. However, it is their privilege and grace to be received as neighbors when their boundary crossing makes them strangers in other people's situations of lands. So sometimes we're on either side of this. We can be on the us. Sometimes we're moving into the world of the thems. We can be in both ways. And when we do that, we become strangers in that way. As the road between Jericho and Jerusalem is a dangerous but life-changing journey.